Have you ever wondered what it would actually take to shrink a living creature down to the size of a marble and store it in a tiny ball? I mean, we've all seen Ash casually toss a Pokéball and somehow fit an entire Snorlax inside something smaller than a baseball. But what if I told you that the physics behind Pokéballs might not be as impossible as you think? The technology that powers these iconic red and white spheres has fascinated fans for decades, but most people have never really thought about the mind-bending science that would be required to make them work in our world. Today, we're going to dive deep into the theoretical physics, the biological nightmares, and the engineering challenges that would need to be solved to create real Pokeballs. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why these devices represent some of the most advanced technology ever conceived, and honestly, you might never look at them the same way again. We're talking about matter compression, energy storage, consciousness preservation, and quantum mechanics that would make Einstein's head spin. Plus, I'll reveal the one fundamental law of physics that makes Pokeballs theoretically possible, even though it sounds completely insane. But first, let me blow your mind with something most people never consider about these devices. Did you know that a single Pokeball would need to store more energy than a nuclear power plant generates in an entire year? That's just to handle the basic compression process. And we haven't even talked about keeping the creature alive inside. The amount of technology packed into something the size of a tennis ball would represent the pinnacle of human engineering, assuming we could even figure out how to build it. Here's what makes this so fascinating, though. While shrinking living beings sounds like pure fantasy, the individual components needed to create Pokeballs actually exist in some form today. We have matter compression technology, energy storage systems, and even basic stasis fields. The problem is combining all of these into something that actually works without killing everything you try to capture. Think about it this way. Every time a trainer throws a Pokeball, they're essentially creating a pocket dimension, compressing matter to impossible densities, preserving biological functions, and maintaining consciousness, all while keeping the device small enough to fit in their backpack. It's like carrying around a dozen Nobel Prize-winning inventions in your pocket. So let's start with the most obvious question that everyone asks, but nobody really thinks through properly. How do you actually shrink something without destroying it completely? Most people assume Pokeballs work by making things smaller, like some kind of shrink ray you'd see in a cartoon. But here's the thing that'll change how you think about this forever. Real Pokeballs wouldn't shrink anything at all. Instead, they'd have to work by manipulating space itself. Picture this scenario. You're trying to fit an elephant into a shoebox. The obvious approach is to make the elephant smaller, but that creates massive problems. Where does all that extra mass go? How do you compress bones and organs without turning them into mush? How do you maintain blood flow when everything is squeezed down to a fraction of its original size? The answer is you don't. Instead, you make the inside of the shoebox bigger than the outside. This isn't science fiction either. It's actually based on real physics concepts that scientists study today. We're talking about manipulating space-time itself to create what's called a spatial anomaly. Think of it like this. From the outside, your Pokeball looks like a normal sphere maybe 6 inches across. But inside, there's enough space for a creature the size of a building to move around comfortably. The space inside is literally bigger than the space outside, which sounds impossible until you realize that space itself is flexible. Einstein proved this over a century ago when he showed that massive objects can warp space-time. Black holes do this naturally, creating regions where space is so distorted that the normal rules break down. A Pokeball would essentially be a controlled black hole, except instead of crushing everything into a singularity, it creates a stable pocket of expanded space. But here's where things get really crazy. Creating this kind of spatial distortion would require technology so advanced that it makes our current understanding of physics look like cave paintings. We're talking about manipulating the fundamental fabric of reality itself. The energy requirements alone would be staggering. To create a stable spatial anomaly, you'd need to generate gravitational fields comparable to those found near neutron stars. That's the kind of gravity that can bend light and slow down time. And somehow, all of this has to be powered by a device small enough to clip onto a 10-year-old's belt. Now, assuming you could somehow solve the spatial manipulation problem, you'd immediately run into the next massive challenge. How do you keep a living creature alive inside a pocket dimension? This is where most people's understanding of Pokeballs completely falls apart. They think the creature just sits there in some kind of suspended animation, waiting to be released. But biological systems don't work that way. Living things need oxygen, nutrients, waste removal, and proper temperature regulation. Even in a state of suspended animation, cellular processes continue. Inside a Pokeball, you'd need to create a perfect artificial environment. We're talking about atmospheric processors, waste recycling systems, nutrient delivery mechanisms, and temperature controls, all miniaturized to fit inside that expanded space. It's like building a complete life support system for a spacecraft, except it has to work indefinitely and never break down. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Different creatures would need completely different environments. A fire type would need much higher temperatures than an ice type. A water type would need humidity levels that would kill a grass type. Some creatures are massive and need room to move around, while others are tiny and need specialized microenvironments. This means every Pokeball would need to be programmable, capable of analyzing the creature it's capturing and automatically adjusting its internal environment to match. The processing power required would be enormous, and it would all have to happen in the fraction of a second between when the ball opens and when the creature is stored. And here's something that'll really mess with your head. Time would flow differently inside the Pokeball compared to the outside world. Remember that spatial distortion we talked about? Well, when you warp space, you automatically warp time too. Einstein called this space-time for a reason. They're connected. So while a trainer might carry a Pokeball for months, the creature inside might experience only minutes or hours. This could actually be a feature, not a bug. It would explain how creatures don't age significantly while stored, and why they don't go insane from being trapped in a small space for extended periods. But managing this time dilation would require incredibly precise calculations. Too much, and the creature's biological processes would slow down to the point where they'd essentially freeze. Too little, and they'd age rapidly while stored. The Pokeball would need to constantly monitor and adjust the temporal field to maintain the perfect balance. Now let's talk about the one aspect of Pokeballs that makes even theoretical physicists scratch their heads. How do you maintain consciousness and memory while a creature is stored? This isn't just about keeping the brain alive. It's about preserving the complex electrical patterns that make up thoughts, memories, and personality. The human brain processes information through incredibly delicate electrical signals between neurons. Disrupt those signals, and you lose everything that makes a person who they are. For a Pokeball to work properly, it would need to somehow map and preserve these neural patterns during the storage process, then perfectly recreate them when the creature is released. We're talking about scanning and storing the complete state of a brain down to the individual neuron level. The data storage requirements would be mind-boggling. A human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others. The amount of information needed to perfectly recreate that network would be measured in exabytes. That's more data than exists on the entire internet, and it would all have to fit inside a device the size of a baseball. But here's the really fascinating part. If you could actually build this technology, Pokeballs wouldn't just be useful for capturing creatures. They'd represent the ultimate solution to dozens of humanity's biggest problems. Imagine being able to store food indefinitely without spoilage. transport massive amounts of cargo in tiny containers, or even preserve endangered species in perfect stasis until their habitats could be restored. The implications go far beyond just catching pocket monsters. We're talking about technology that could revolutionize space travel, medicine, agriculture, and conservation. A single breakthrough in spatial manipulation could change everything about how we live and work. Of course, there's still the question of whether any of this is actually possible, or if we're just dreaming about impossible physics. The truth is, some of the smartest people on Earth are working on problems that could eventually lead to Pokéball-like technology. They're not trying to catch Pikachu, but they are exploring spatial manipulation, matter compression, and consciousness preservation. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If we could build real Pokeballs, should we? The ethical implications of real Pokeballs would be absolutely staggering. And honestly, most people haven't even begun to think about what we'd be unleashing on the world. We're not just talking about capturing wild animals here. We're talking about technology that could fundamentally alter the relationship between humans and every other living thing on the planet. Think about it from the creature's perspective for a moment. 1 second you're living your life, the next second you're trapped in what's essentially a pocket universe, completely at the mercy of whoever threw that ball. Sure, the environment inside might be perfect, but you'd have zero control over when you get released, where you end up, or what you're forced to do once you're out. Now imagine if this technology fell into the wrong hands. Forget about friendly neighborhood trainers trying to become champions. What happens when governments start using Pokeballs for military purposes? What happens when corporations start capturing endangered species and selling them to the highest bidder? What happens when criminals realize they can store massive amounts of contraband in devices that look like harmless toys? The potential for abuse would be limitless. You could smuggle anything across any border. You could kidnap someone and store them in a device that fits in your pocket. You could steal entire buildings by compressing them down and walking away. The technology that makes Pokeballs possible would also make them the most dangerous weapons ever created. But let's assume for a moment that we could somehow regulate this technology and prevent the worst abuses. Even then, we'd be facing moral questions that would make philosophers' heads spin. Do captured creatures have rights? Can they consent to being stored? What happens if they don't want to be released? What happens if the storage process somehow changes their personality or memories? And here's something that'll really mess with your understanding of how Pokeballs work. The creatures inside wouldn't just be sitting there waiting to come out. They'd be existing in a completely artificial reality, possibly unaware that they're even stored. For all they know, they could be living in a perfect simulation of their natural habitat, with simulated food, simulated weather, and simulated social interactions. This raises the question of whether the creature inside is even the same individual that was captured. If their consciousness is being digitally preserved and recreated, are they still the original being, or are they just a copy with the same memories? This isn't just philosophical speculation either. It's a real problem that neuroscientists and computer researchers are grappling with right now. The technology required to solve this consciousness problem would be absolutely revolutionary. We're talking about the ability to perfectly map, store, and recreate the complete mental state of any living being. If you could do that with a creature, you could do it with a human. And if you could do it with a human, you'd essentially have achieved digital immortality. Imagine being able to back up your consciousness like a computer file. Death would become optional. You could live forever by transferring your mind from one body to another, or even exist purely as digital information. The implications would be so profound that they'd completely reshape what it means to be human. But achieving this level of consciousness manipulation would require solving problems that make rocket science look like elementary arithmetic. The human brain isn't just a computer. It's a biological system that's been shaped by millions of years of evolution. Every thought, every memory, Every emotion emerges from the complex interactions of neurons, chemicals, and electrical signals. To perfectly recreate that system, you'd need to understand not just how individual neurons work, but how they interact with each other, how they respond to different chemicals, how they change over time, and how they're influenced by the body they're connected to. You'd need to map every connection, measure every electrical signal, and track every chemical reaction. The computing power required would be astronomical. Current estimates suggest that simulating a human brain would require a computer capable of performing over 1 billion calculations per second. That's more processing power than exists in all the computers on Earth combined. And remember, this would all have to fit inside a device the size of a tennis ball. Even if we could somehow miniaturize that much computing power, we'd still need to solve the energy problem. All that processing would generate enormous amounts of heat, enough to melt the Pokéball and probably burn whoever's holding it. You'd need revolutionary advances in cooling technology, energy efficiency, and heat dissipation. And we haven't even talked about the manufacturing challenges. How do you build devices this complex? How do you quality test them? How do you ensure they don't malfunction and accidentally delete someone's consciousness? How do you mass produce them cheaply enough that every trainer can afford one? The precision required would be beyond anything we've ever attempted. We're talking about manipulating matter at the quantum level, controlling gravitational fields with microscopic accuracy, and managing energy flows that would make a nuclear reactor look like a flashlight. A single mistake in the manufacturing process could result in catastrophic failure. But here's what makes this whole discussion even more mind-bending. If Pokeballs were real, they wouldn't just change how we interact with creatures. They'd change how we think about reality itself. When you can compress space, manipulate time, and digitize consciousness, the boundaries between what's real and what's artificial start to break down. How would you know if you're living in the real world or inside a Pokeball? How would you know if your memories are genuine or artificially implanted? How would you know if the people around you are real or just sophisticated simulations? These aren't just science fiction questions. They're logical consequences of the technology we're discussing. The social implications would be staggering. If anyone could be stored and released at will, traditional concepts of freedom, privacy, and individual rights would become meaningless. If consciousness could be copied and backed up, questions of identity and personal responsibility would become incredibly complex. If space and time could be manipulated, our understanding of physics and reality would be fundamentally altered. And that's assuming the technology even works as advertised. What if there are side effects we haven't considered? What if prolonged storage causes psychological damage? What if the spatial distortion fields interfere with each other? What if the consciousness preservation process isn't perfect and creatures come out slightly different each time? The testing phase alone would be a nightmare. You can't exactly volunteer to be the first human test subject for experimental consciousness storage technology. The ethical review boards would have a field day. And what happens if something goes wrong during testing? How do you fix a damaged consciousness? How do you restore someone who's been partially deleted? But despite all these challenges, despite all the ethical concerns, despite all the technological hurdles, there's something undeniably appealing about the idea of real Pokeballs, the ability to explore the world with powerful companions, to preserve endangered species, to solve problems that seem impossible with current technology. Maybe that's why the concept has captured our imagination for so long. Pokeballs represent the ultimate fusion of technology and biology, the perfect harmony between human innovation and natural wonder. They're not just tools for capturing creatures. They're symbols of humanity's endless quest to understand and control the world around us. And who knows? Maybe someday, some brilliant scientist will figure out how to make it all work. Maybe they'll solve the consciousness problem. crack the spatial manipulation puzzle, and create the energy storage systems needed to power it all. Maybe they'll find a way to make Pokeballs that are safe, ethical, and beneficial for everyone involved. But until that day comes, we'll just have to keep dreaming about what it would be like to live in a world where you could carry entire ecosystems in your pocket, where space and time bend to your will, and where the impossible becomes routine.